Welcome to the Geek Homeworld. I am your host, SavageTechman. We talk sci-fi, TV, movies, superheroes, and all from a geek perspective. You can find us on Blogger, Google+, Twitter, Facebook. We're everywhere. Join the Geek Homeworld. Welcome to another episode of the Geek Homeworld podcast, and I'm glad you survived the apocalypse, and hopefully there's more apocalypse to come. I'm, of course, talking about X-Men Apocalypse, a movie I've been waiting since the 1990s when the Age of Apocalypse comics came out, and I was just super excited to see the movie. What are my overall feelings? Well, now that some weeks have passed since the opening, I can say I was more excited originally going in, and the end result was not bad. Now, looking at some of the recent box office returns on X-Men Apocalypse, it's done less than Days of Future Past, which I thought was a good, solid movie in the right direction. Yes, it had problems. Yes, this movie has issues. There's issues of continuity. There's different things. But I feel it's still moving in the right direction. Is it the perfect apocalypse movie that I wanted to see? No. But it did hit on a few key points that I did enjoy. And let's first, before we get into deconstructing the movie and my thoughts here about it, let's talk about the villain Apocalypse. Apocalypse is basically the first mutant, and you've seen the trailers to the movie. Anybody who's read the Apocalypse storylines through the comics, you know his origin, so no need to really rehash it. But for those uninitiated to Apocalypse, his main motivation is survival of the fittest. And basically his theory is, if you were comparing it to real science, would be Darwinism. And Darwinism came from Charles Darwin, who lived in the 1800s there. And his origin of species is what he's known for, and he basically talks about species and organisms that go through what's called natural selection. And like, you have an organism and it goes through the evolution of time, and even Neil deGrasse Tyson has talked about this. I was watching him recently on Bill Maher. He was on his show there, and he was talking about science doesn't care whether you believe it or not. You know, like, global warming exists whether you believe it or not, whether it's, politicized or not. Science doesn't care what you think about it. Science just is, and there are facts. And that's another discussion for another time. But Darwinism and natural selection is sort of the same thing, in the sense that it is science, and some people believe in that theory of evolution, basically. And you can see where this conversation could go into several different, as it were, avenues of discussion. But Darwinism talks about, and what Apocalypse deals with in the movie. Okay, let's first talk about Darwinism. Darwinism basically says that you have an organism, and all the environmental factors that are there, it has to basically adapt to survive. And if it doesn't, then part of the species will die off, and evolution, in the sense, will make it stronger, better, faster. Not the $6 Million Man through bionics, but eventually that can go into another avenue of cybernetics, and that's we've touched a little bit on the podcast here about that, and that's something that I want to jump back into on a later episode. And you can check some of our back catalog. You'll see where I talked a little bit about that. But when Darwinism, the theory, came out, and there were concepts of the transmutation of species, and I think it was 1859 when On the Origin of Species came out. And so Darwinism basically says that, it's survival of the fittest. So that is what Apocalypse, his whole thought is, okay? He's basically in this movie, and I will tell you, this is an episode that is total spoiler alert. Have you not heard me say that yet? It's been a couple of weeks. You should have gone out and seen it. Had you not seen it, then come back a little bit later for, this episode. But anyway, spoiler alert. So in the movie, Apocalypse is basically an Egyptian god, or seen as a god. He's really the first mutant. Now, from the comics, there were the Celestials, and they had a crashed ship on Earth, and Apocalypse came across that, and that augmented his powers, made them better, essentially, along with his mutation to take mutants' powers. Apocalypse is super intelligent, he's super strong, and in this movie you can see that even though he was the first mutant on Earth in this movie, and they were basically treating him as a god in Egypt, he had to go into what would be called his Lazarus chamber, and he would regenerate, and basically his body burns up. It can't handle the mutations and all that power. So after a while, his cellular structure breaks down, and then he basically transfers his consciousness to another body that can sustain that, and then hopefully a stronger body, a fellow mutant. So if he were the first mutant, the problem with that is there are actually other mutants that he got his powers from. Now, the actor who played Apocalypse did a wonderful job. I think this movie was well acted. Apocalypse himself as a villain, I thought, was a very good representation of him. It wasn't everything I wanted to see out of Apocalypse. We did see later on when Professor X was fighting him on the astral plane, which was pretty cool. I would have loved to see more of that, but you saw where he could change his size, essentially. And that's a pretty cool power to have. You manipulate your molecular structure so you could either be short or tall. Kind of like Pym particles, if you think about it. But that's in another part of Marvel with Ant-Man and Civil War, where we saw that. And you want to check our episode about Civil War on that. Anyway, so Apocalypse in this movie is just straight up Apocalypse. How do I say it? He is controlling things. He basically reawakes in our current time after this hibernation sleep in his Lazarus chamber after it's been uncovered. It's been over 1,000 years, and so, at least from the time of the Egyptians to the present. And so he awakens and he starts amassing his powers and his 4 horsemen, one of which is Storm. And his 4 horsemen that he always has are endued with even more powers. He gives them, heightens their powers, basically turns them up to 11, From there, their powers are elevated, and he has his 4 horsemen. One of the most favorite ones of mine, obviously, is Archangel. And from the comics, Angel in the Mutant Massacre had his wings chopped off in the Morlock tunnels, and then Apocalypse finds him, gives him mechanical wings and everything. One of the essential, I guess you would call it, adaptations of Apocalypse and is from the 1996 Fox Kids TV show X-Men, which if you have not seen that, you must see that, and it does really a very good representation of the Apocalypse and his 4 horsemen. And it talks basically about, similar to the movie here, how a mutant is drawn almost mad by his powers, at least in the cartoon he was. And there is some reasoning behind Apocalypse. He is probably the X-Men's greatest foe. And even though, that being said, Apocalypse is just on his mission to get his 4 horsemen and to basically, as the tagline from the movie basically says, he's about to tear the world apart, and from the ashes he's going to build a new world, a better world. He essentially takes all the nuclear weapons in the world, launches them into wherever, space, I guess they all explode, go away, boom, they're gone. So he takes away everything. They were fighting him with sticks back in the times of Egypt when he was a young mutant, and he took all the weapons of the world away, so no one could really defeat him. And then he tries to get Xavier. When Xavier reaches out with Cerebro, and he feels the power of Apocalypse, and he is just amazed by the power, and he kind of pulls Xavier in. And part of the part here, when they're fighting and doing the transference, they eventually capture Xavier, and they try to transfer the power, the essence from Apocalypse to Xavier, and that's kind of how he loses his hair. They pull him out at the last minute, and it doesn't happen. And Apocalypse gets away, or does he? I don't think he's gone. But there are very important moments in this film, and one of them is when Jean Grey, she's so scared, she keeps having these horrific dreams of the end of the world, essentially before this altercation when Apocalypse occurs. And so she's talking with Xavier, and Xavier's like, it's just a dream. It's all good from Diego to the Bay. And, but we find out later that when Charles is about to just be killed, be totally taken over by Apocalypse, that Jean unleashes the Phoenix Force and all that. And in this movie, this was probably the first time we really saw that done the right way. There are a lot of things I liked about this movie. One of them, the new team was good with Cyclops. Finally, Cyclops was not a wimp. He didn't get just obliterated by Jean Grey. That's gone from the timeline, thank you. Because Jean Grey would never, ever, ever, ever kill Scott. We get to see Jean Grey. We get to see Phoenix, or what could lead to Dark Phoenix. In future films, we see Nightcrawler, along with established characters such as Quicksilver, who, once again, along with that Jean Grey moment where she's using the Phoenix Force for the first time and essentially defeats Apocalypse, which was that Apocalypse's plan all along, to draw the Phoenix Force out of her, to elevate her to that next level that she was afraid to get to. So between Apocalypse, maybe that was his whole end game. Who knows? But Quicksilver stole the movie again, just like he did in Days of Future Past, that wonderful scene when time in a bottle and he was saving Magneto, and he's all flying around there. Well, not flying, excuse me. He's running so fast he's like running on walls and everywhere else. And anyway, so the X-Mansion gets blown up after Havoc gets killed trying to defend the X-Men there, which is crazy that they killed Havoc. I didn't get that. But Quicksilver basically is running through all the destruction to the tune of Sweet Dreams Are Made of This by the Eurythmics, which this film is obviously set in the 80s. The next film would be, we're told, is going to be in the 90s. And it was just one of the best scenes in the movie. Quicksilver just always seems to steal the scene, and this scene was even longer and greater and more dynamic than his scene stealer in Days of Future Past. There was a lower cost budget on this movie that allowed for better effects, and I thought the effects enhanced the story. They didn't get in the way too much of the story. And even though the critics came out and just kind of tore this movie apart, similar to Batman vs. Superman, and it's not done maybe more than 140 million right now at the time we're recording this, and a couple weeks out, which is kind of low. It's lower than Days of Future Past at this point, and so I'm a little concerned by that. It's doing better globally, so about 70% of its box office has come from overseas, so hopefully that saves it enough that we get more X-Men movies, and I'm sure we will, but I really wanted this to be a great big blockbuster of a movie, and I'm not sure that it's going to be that big of a movie, especially coming out following Civil War. When you look at this summer's movies, Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice, you look at X-Men Apocalypse, and then you look at Civil War, Captain America, which has done over $1 billion at the box office, 1.1 and counting globally, and very well stateside. You see the tone is so much different. When I was going into Civil War, I was expecting gloom and doom, and that didn't happen, thankfully. It did to an extent, but it still felt there still was humor in it. There was Batman vs. Superman had a little bit of humor, even though it was more serious. Now, Apocalypse had some humor in it, especially Quicksilver added to that Nightcrawler a little bit to that, but this is still a good movie, and you should go out to see it. And if you don't go out and see movies like this, then eventually the studios will say, okay, let's not make it anymore. I was very excited, as I told you, about the temporary merger of Apocalypse and Professor X's minds, where they melded there, and their fight essentially on the astral plane. And it gives hope to the movie bringing in the character of Onslaught. But if you know your comics, and Onslaught was another great, for me the 90s were the heydays of comics in my lifetime. You know, we had a lot of, into the 80s and especially 90s, we had Days of Future Past, which we've already seen on screen, Age of Apocalypse, and the series of Onslaught, which, spoiler alert, if you haven't read it, you should definitely go read the comics that lead up to it and beyond. But basically, it gives me hope that the next movie will bring in the character of Onslaught, which was kind of a merger of when Wolverine, I think it was it Wolverine 75 was the comic? I can't remember the number. But basically, the X-Men were fighting in Avalon. Magneto and the X-Men are going toe-to-toe. And they, or was it Asteroid M? Anyway, I think they call it Avalon. Anyway, so the X-Men are fighting. You have Apocalypse with Exodus and all his acolytes fighting against all the X-Men. And Professor X had this suit that allowed him to kind of like stand and not be in a wheelchair. And then there were, he was using his psionic abilities there. And he was going toe-to-toe with Magneto. And what spurred this on was, as they were fighting, Wolverine and Magneto get into it, and Magneto rips all of the adamantium metal out of Logan's body completely, which almost kills him. And the X-Plane's about to go down, and they're in this big... It's a very, very well-written storyline, very, very important storyline. And the X-Men are just fighting, and then so Xavier's had enough. He's like, I'm tired of holding back. He basically enters Magneto's mind and shuts down Magneto's mind. But what happens, a little of the evil or whatever the psyche is, or whatever you want to call it, in Magneto's mind creeps into Xavier's mind without Xavier realizing it. And over time with the storyline, let's see, Professor X, this kind of gets in with his dark side and all his repressed feelings, and we see kind of a dark Professor X, kind of like Dark Phoenix, but dark Professor X. And this entity eventually becomes an actual entity that grows out of his mind, so to speak, and it's called Onslaught. And then it eventually takes the Fantastic Four, the Hulk. It brings everybody from all the comics all over the place to try to fight Onslaught. And to one point, he builds a citadel in like New York, and he's going to destroy everything. And he's just knocking down heroes. Like the Hulk gets separated, I think, from Banner, and there's a lot of comic storyline there, and fascinating story. And I know we won't see it with all the different titles. Fantastic Four, they'd have to bring in all the X-Men in. That's a lot of money, and I don't know that it could be done. But the character of Onslaught mixing with Apocalypse, because they're kind of connected, once they enter each other's minds. So once Professor X they get into each other's minds. So it gives me a glimmer of hope that maybe will be set in the 90s, and then maybe we'll see Onslaught in some form, hopefully done right, who kind of looks like, if you've ever, Google it, if you hadn't read the comics, but you definitely should on Onslaught. But he basically kind of looks like Magneto anyway, and the X-Men don't really know who it is for a while. And there's one point in the storyline where Juggernaut gets thrown literally across the country or something, and it's because of Onslaught, essentially. And it just, like, freaks him out, you know, because he's the first person that Onslaught goes after. And, you know, it's an awesome story. But back to X-Men Apocalypse. You know, I was thinking something when Apocalypse goes in Xavier's mind and reaches all the mutants through Cerebro and all that stuff. He could have just waited 10 more years had he woken up in, like, the mid to late 90s. He could have just used the internet. But then it would have been all Jerry Springer and everything else, so who knows? Who knows? It would have been Kardashians and all. He'd be controlling the Kardashians at this point, I suppose. I don't know. The story of Magneto trying to deal with the after effects and the events of Days of Future Past, and in this movie he starts a family, so he's kind of got a different name, he's in a different place, and then he gets basically people he's worked with, and they find out he's Magneto, and his little daughter can control animals somehow, or a mutation, which they didn't know she had. And so the animals come after them, they end up accidentally or whatever killing his wife and daughter, so Magneto just lets loose on them, essentially. And then this is part of his downward spiral, and then Apocalypse comes to him and says, hey, bud, you know, you can control the elements of the earth, the magnetic field of the earth. And that's when we see Magneto just letting loose. And Quicksilver realizes in the movie that, which he kind of did in Days of Future Past, that Magneto's his dad, and he has a point there where Raven is trying to convince Magneto to stop, and eventually she does, and he asks Quicksilver about his family or something, and this and that, and Quicksilver doesn't really tell him and all that they're related, that he's his dad, and so that's for another film. But it's got the wonderful Four Horsemen in there. They're doing awesome things. Storm ends up turning good. Psylocke, she gets away, and Magneto turns back to good and all that, and they sort of banish Apocalypse, but I don't think he's really gone. But Magneto's storyline, very powerful. Michael Fassbender, great job as that tormented soul. The end scene credits end with, you see where essentially it's Mr. Sinister coming in before he's Mr. Sinister, before they get a hold of him, and he's going to create in the future a clone of Weapon X, which we see in the movie brilliantly, which is Wolverine, aka Logan. And I want more Mr. Sinister, please. I want to see the full costume, and, you know, a dude with all the powers from Apocalypse. It'll be awesome. You know, Nathaniel Essex, and it says Essex on the briefcase there, or whatever. When he takes the blood sample of Weapon X, and so we're going to probably get X-23, which is a female kind of clone of Weapon X. So then after Hugh Jackman's gone, after the last Wolverine movie, which is going to be awesome, R-rated, we'll probably see X-23 showing up in some way, maybe even in that movie. And speaking of Weapon X, we finally on film get to see some of that true berserker rage that we see it, some of it, but for the rating we weren't quite at R on X-Men Apocalypse, so we didn't see all of it. But Hugh Jackman just lets loose there, and you know, we'll see him the last time in the R-rated version of the last Wolverine movie. There were inconsistencies. I said earlier, there were some things that just didn't kind of jive in this movie, and there's problems with this film. It's not the best Apocalypse film we could have, but it was thoroughly enjoying to me. I actually want to go see it again, and I tried to like it on its own merits. I didn't like Havoc dying. That made no sense to the overall story arc here, as well as Archangel dying in the battle. Nightcrawler was not revealed to be Mystique's son of her and Azrael. I was hoping at some point during this trilogy with Days of Future Past and for X-Men First Class and Apocalypse that we'd see that, and we didn't. But we got as close to a badass Cyclops as we did in the comics. Though he's not quite there yet, we got our Dark Phoenix that could be coming up, and hopefully a better version than in X-Men The Last Stand. And this is the end, like I said, of the First Class trilogy that focused on Mystique, Professor X, and Magneto. And it may be beginning of a focus on Cyclops, Jean Grey, Nightcrawler, or like a younger team of X-Men. And they're supposedly working on an X-Force movie, which I can't wait because that means Cable. I was hoping for a Cable to show up in this movie. He didn't. It's not cast yet, so I understand that. But I love the ending of Deadpool. One of my favorite parts of that movie was that Cable would be in the next Deadpool sequel. So guess what? I want him in X-Force. That would be awesome. So anyway, those are my thoughts on X-Men Apocalypse. Let us know what you think. And I want to thank you for joining us for another wonderful episode of the Geek Homeworld podcast. So geek on. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Geek Homeworld podcast with your host, SavageTechman. You can find us on Libsyn, Google+, follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, listen to us on iTunes, see us on YouTube, be part of our Mixler chats. Thank you. See you again on the Geek Homeworld podcast.